You're listening to the Jōrni Podcast. When you spend decades feeling different but cannot explain why, where do you even begin to look for answers that no one seems to have? Join me today for an extraordinary story of breaking the silence and challenging mental health stigma. This episode contains adult subject matter and some listeners may be triggered by this content. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Jōrni Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. What does it feel like to know something is profoundly wrong, but have no language for the pain, to spend decades being told to just try harder when the very act of trying pushes you further into isolation? Some of us carry defenses formed so early in childhood that we mistake them for who we are. And those protective patterns become the walls that keep out everything we think we want. Blair Sorrel is an author, innovator, and animal lover. She was a Free Times dollar-wise dilettante columnist, Together Dating Services matchmaker, and New York Blood Services apheresis recruiter. She founded street apps to protect dogs and people from stray voltage, and was the first community representative invited by Con Edison to their annual Jody S. Lane Stray Voltage Detection, Mitigation, and Prevention National Conference. Here is my interview with Blair Sorrel. Hi, Blair. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because growing up with Schizoid Personality Disorder is a very profound topic, and I'm very much looking forward to actually discussing that with you and getting your perspective on that for our listeners. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's my absolute pleasure. I feel this is one of the topics that we don't talk about enough and don't have enough episodes on the podcast. And yet people are very curious and they want to know more. So would you like to start us off with maybe the parts of your own journey or your own story that you would like to share that connect a little bit to who you are and what your journey has been like?
As with most people with schizoid personality, they're oblivious to the condition. They know that they're different, they're in pain, but they don't know why. And usually when it is diagnosed, and it relatively rarely is, it's through another comorbidity or condition. It could be anxiety, depression, or something else. And then they kind of stumble on that they have a defense or maladaptation, a character disorder known as schizoid personality disorder. Schizoids see themselves as loners, and they tend to avoid contact. Depending upon their level of anxiety, they will have impaired concentration. So it becomes problematic in school and then eventually in employment. They're in fantasy more. I want to be careful in noting that not every schizoid is impaired. The other symptoms would include chronic tardiness, poor social skills, inability to form goals, difficulty with decisions. These are telltale. Anything that's going to put a schizoid in close relations with other people is going to be problematic. And so it's not only the afflicted who are affected, but their coworkers, their parents, their teachers, all of it down the line. And it becomes dangerous, in my opinion, when somebody never goes to a doctor, gets a preventative screening, seeks any kind of legal or financial guidance, and self-victimizes. This condition accounts for high levels of homelessness. And I was told that when I went into treatment in the 80s. And if you look on schizoid personality in Wikipedia, 65% of a New York City drop-in center were schizoid. I would be willing to wager that the weather was extremely bitter, or those folks would have opted for a subway grate instead. There are, of course, outliers like the Bowers case in Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life shooting, who was schizoid. But generally speaking, they're innocuous. I think the condition is far more problematic and potentially pernicious to the afflicted. It's painful to live with it, even if it isn't life-threatening or self-victimizing in such extreme ways.
Thank you for sharing that. It gives us a little bit of insight about that. And Blair, how did that play out in your own life when you were younger? Were you aware that something was going on that was affecting you? And how did you come to a place where you actually became aware of the fact that it was schizoid personality disorder?
Well, I knew that I was different. I was bullied in school. I was ostracized a lot socially. I was made aware that I wasn't all there, that I missed a lot. I was chronically tardy, which victimized me with friendships and, of course, with employment. It's just I felt, probably as do many others, that it would get better on its own if I found the right kind of work or career, boyfriend, husband. Of course, none of that was really possible because it blocked me in all areas, because I wasn't going to get close enough to anybody to allow it for a career or a marital status or even dating. Things got really out of hand and so terrible that I was working on an advertising portfolio and I never wanted to show it to anyone. I was so phobic about presenting or approaching or being vulnerable to somebody else's opinion or criticism. I was conditioned to anticipate rejection from my family. It was all what I carried over elsewhere, who were overwhelmingly negative and critical, and it's what forced me into withdrawal, which is psychojargon for a fantasy state. So at that juncture, I went to a clinician, and she recognized immediately that I suffered from SPD. When she heard about the jobs, the way I spoke, she did testing, none of which was grounded in reality. But she did inform me it would take a long time. And I was 33 at the time. I didn't know what the odds of recovery would be. So I was advised by New York State Office of Disability to stay out of an office and to get help with concentration. And they knew I could write. But that was also problematic because freelance became free. I couldn't earn a livable wage. My writing was too sophisticated for a lot of commercial places. Nowadays, there is remote work, which I think would be a good option for SPD. But the schizoid is going to have more difficulty meeting deadlines and seeking payment. It's anything that's going to put you in closer contact with other people.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm very curious as to what was it that actually made you see a clinician at that time in your 30s? It feels like already a large portion of your life you lived with these experiences. And what actually made you want to maybe know more about this or find an answer? Or was there something that caused you to think that there should be an answer to what you were experiencing? Or how did that come about?
Well, I'm very analytical by nature and inquiring, and I began to bone up on the subject. And they say that you need to write from experience. This isn't the kind of experience I would have wanted to write from, but it was my God-given. There I was with something that I could do something with somehow. And the trick in life is to take anything bad and turn it into something good, as Teilhard de Chardin observed, the Jesuit philosopher. So it was the pandemic, and I was a zozoid, very used to being shut in and social distancing came quite naturally. So there I was writing a chapter a month. I employed Harry Friedman, the author, as my coach because I had really never written anything of that substance or length, and it was a bit daunting, but it was doable because I could go on Wikipedia and rely on my wits to put this together. And fortunately, I could remember far enough to reconstruct what happens and theorize how this happens with the hope of preventing it, or at least goading earlier intervention so that people don't become homeless. They don't become totally dependent on their parents. The parents don't become lifelong benefactors to their kids, which absolutely can be the inevitable, because if you can't earn a livable wage, and they may not be able to self-protect, don't forget there are always going to be manipulators and scammers, and anyone who goes through life never feeling loved is going to be all the more susceptible to those people. The other instance of a schizoid that I know is a man with an MBA who is now living in a homeless shelter. He could not support his parents' home. He lived there lifelong. In spite of his inheritance pension, he was in a federal job, isolated one, data entry. Apparently, he didn't save anything. He never learned to budget. He couldn't self-care in the way that more normal people do. That's the issue that I'm talking about, just as I mentioned about doctor visits. What other people take as just de rigueur, they don't, because they're too phobic about reaching out or making themselves vulnerable. They're blocked from intimacy. So Adult Protective Services had to move him out of his parents' home and into the shelter and become his guardian. So you may be spawning children who grow old but never grow up, in the sense that they don't individuate and they don't self-care. And so that kind of financial onus. Do you want kids who are never going to leave the house, date, can't make eye contact, are subjected to a litany of harassments to the tune of, you don't think, you don't listen, you're always late, you're weird, you're not motivated. People strike at what they don't understand. And this is how this phobia will play out. It's unfortunate. It is entirely preventable because no baby is born with a defense. And more neurotypical people go into situations anticipating both acceptance and rejection. I think schizoids anticipate overwhelming rejection, and they literally shy away from social interaction. Having written the book, I'm no more of a schmoozer than I ever was, but I felt that this was a public service initiative that needed to be addressed, because, of course, it's a toll to the individual, the family, the schools, but it's a societal toll, social services. And it's a stunted life. Homelessness is a complex issue, but to the extent to which it contributes, I wanted to address.
Yeah. And what is the title of your book, Blair? Will you share that with our listeners?
A Schizoid at Smith, How Overparenting Leads to Underachieving.
Okay. And we'll make sure we link that in the show notes. But tell us a little bit about how that book unfolded. You said you were writing on that and looking things up. And what can our listeners expect if they purchase your book and they read that? What would you like them to take away from that, other than maybe the public service that you just mentioned? Could they also find some things in there for themselves or for their loved ones or someone they might know who might be struggling like that? What would you like our listeners to take away from that book?
The impact of words. I love words. I'm a wordsmith. But words can be cruel and they can be kind and they can have long-term effects on people. They can also be formative to this disorder. If they're overwhelmingly negative, think about it. What defense does a kid have than to tune out? And I'm sure you know people in your own life that you stop listening to because they're insufferable. To take a more balanced approach as parents And if you're incapable as parents, seek professional intervention. Don't do as my mother did, my homework, for example, that crippled me. I am finding that neurotypical people identify because everybody at some point or other feels inadequate, I don't fit in, has experienced rejection, doesn't like to play the politics of an office or the performative social rights, may have problems with intimacy, had an overbearing mother. You know, as Woody Allen said in Manhattan, two mothers I could barely handle one. So there is, surprisingly to me, people who are not troubled, who identify or feel that there's a kind of authenticity in the book. It's a fun read in spite of the sad storyline, and anybody who likes classic rock will enjoy it. Plus, you get to tell your own story. There's a template for the soundtrack of your life, a song and what memories it brings back, so you can craft your own keepsake. That's a gift with purchase. And there is the playlist. Songs appear as emotional proxies because they articulate what I really couldn't and allowed me to connect in situations and find solace and refuge.
Thank you for that. And I think that would be a wonderful read for anyone, even to just gain a little bit more understanding of what happens when someone is struggling with schizoid personality disorder. Even children, or they might recognize it in themselves or someone else, and be able to actually provide more support or insight. So that sounds wonderful. And Blair, I'm curious, when you received the diagnosis, did that help you in any kind of way? Did you think at that point, wow, now I know what is happening? Or did you find this helpful in any way? Or did you find that receiving an actual diagnosis hindered you in some kind of way, or made it worse? What was that experience like for you?
Well, in a way, it was a relief. And since I could never form a goal or have a professional degree, no MD, no MBA, no JD, I was suddenly SPD. So that gave me a distinction. I also kind of felt, since she said it would be a lengthy, that I was defeated because, of course, we want quick fixes and our society is structured for those. Emily Dickinson is thought to have been schizoid. There are a lot of artists and writers, but of course, in their age and day, they didn't have to go into offices or have the same demands. A clinician would say that man is made to be social and that there's greater potential for happiness. My concern isn't so much that schizoids date or marry or, most people underachieve, but I am, as I mentioned earlier, that they don't self-care in fundamental ways and that their lifespan is reduced through negligence because they're going to be blocked and they're not going to do what most people do by definition.
And so are there ways to provide support? Did you receive support at any point? Or, I don't know, I guess a standard thing that people usually would look to is some kind of medication. But what does the support actually look like for this kind of disorder? And did you receive any of that?
Well, obviously there aren't going to be meetup groups for something like this, but there are clinicians who are skilled with cognitive therapy. What I found very helpful was to volunteer because I could go into situations and get more used to people and learn skills. The demands aren't as great as employment. If you ran a little late, if you were in fantasy more, it gave me a purpose and structure. I was actually even offered a job one time volunteering at the MS chapter in New York. That became a column because I did so much volunteering. I wrote about free or inexpensive cultural opportunities in New York City, the dollar-wise dilettante. So I used my copywriting background in a different way. I think as long as you can structure your time and feel valued, and it also gives you a perspective because you may be interacting with people who are terminally ill, who have more significant problems than being afraid of people.
And did you feel that it changed anything in your life? Did you get any kind of support at some point where you thought, okay, that actually made things a little bit easier for me or helped me with certain things? Or was there anything that you found helpful along your journey? Or do you feel that this is just sort of a lifelong struggle that you're working with now?
Well, I don't know that it's ever totally surmountable. I think that you can intuit that there are situations that are more comfortable. Like there are Zoids who would gravitate to isolated professions, lab work, librarian, janitor. Obviously, my father didn't send me to Smith to become a cleaning lady. So I had to find how I could operate. The writing thing as a professional, as I said, was too difficult. It was too hard Scrabble. I couldn't support myself. But nowadays it's different. People opt to do remote work, and there are more normal people who don't like being in an office. They don't like the politics and backbiting. I didn't feel that doomed. I just felt more defeated because it kept, I'd go into offices and they see you can't do the work. They don't understand why you can't do the work. And it's really not their mission to figure that out. I just sort of got by, as I suppose most schizoids do. I gravitated to a city in northern Massachusetts where there is a tremendous amount of social service. And that has been a very good thing. I got my health care under control. I was able to write a book during the pandemic. I'm doing a lot of short pieces now on this topic. So I'm relieved because I would not have wanted to weather the pandemic in a studio in New York City. So, things seem to be more auspicious. And I actually met a man through this book who was in the music industry who was kind of captivated. So it's had its twists, unusual resolution. I think there's always hope. I like to say you can find a way to work, but it may also be that you end up having to live at home because it's not going to be enough of a wage. That's why I'm more interested in preventative or early diagnosis so that you can be put on a better track and where there's more of a probability of, if not cure, manageability.
And do you feel that if that had been discovered earlier in your life, that there would have been a different trajectory for you? Do you feel that that would have made a difference?
Absolutely, positively, without a doubt. And it was reinforced by my therapist. She said, well, if it hadn't, then you could have done extremely well. What good is it going to do? I had no control over what happened to me by the time I was 5 years old. And it was a different era. I think there is more transparency now about conditions that people suppressed. People of the greatest generation, my parents, would see a character disorder as a character failure. That was the bootstrap mentality that everybody can pick themselves up. Well, you can't if you don't have bootstraps.
Yeah, that's true. There was a bit of a different, I want to say, approach in some of the generations before us, that how this was approached, and also maybe a little bit more awareness now around mental health in general, and a bit more opening to awareness of what happens and how we can support people better. So I just want to put that out for listeners, because I think that is so important that you touched on that, is this importance of maybe earlier recognition and awareness that there may be a disorder that can be supported, and it could drastically change, their child's life or their life or the life of a loved one or someone they know. So as you mentioned in the beginning, there are a few things that you can probably kind of become aware of that may point you in the direction that there may be SPD happening. And do you want to just go over some of those things again, Blair, and maybe let our listeners know what you experienced that maybe others can also pick up on maybe with their own children or their loved ones and think of maybe offering more support to them?
Yes, I will. I also want to point out the parents have to consider that they could become lifelong benefactors. It's very, very important to know that if you have a stunted SPD-dependent child who really can't work. My father used his Social Security check to pay the rent of my rent-stabilized apartment in New York so I could go out and volunteer. The man that I described with the MBA, those are real scenarios. So if they don't have the emotional investment in their children, which of course I hope they do, consider that. Those kids may never leave home. If you want to become an empty nester, forget about it. You may not even have a nest egg because you have to keep paying their bills. So there's that. If your child is chronically late, appears to be in fantasy more than other, doesn't seem to have friends, doesn't seem to have any inclination to make friends, to go to social gatherings, becomes withdrawn if you have a guest to your house. My mother likened me to having a cat in the house. We actually had a cat, but I was like another cat. Needless to say, I didn't hide under the bed when visitors approached. So if you see the sort of stuff that your child is excessively withdrawn, but you also have to see in yourself, are you giving your child adequate nurture and love? I don't ever remember my mother telling me she loved me. And if you don't feel loved as a child, it will taint absolutely everything. So consider their behavior, consider your responsibility in their behavior. Consider that it's not a federal crime to have committed poor parenting. There's no license for parenting. There's greater licensing for driving a car. So you didn't know what you were doing, or you were too young, or you had anger management problems. You were too critical or overbearing, and now your kid's withdrawn and seems to be almost autistic. Then you go and get help and say something's awry because I want my child to be well-adjusted and self-supporting. And that doesn't mean that they're going to operate on the pinnacle of success in marital, employment, career, whatever, but that they'll be able to manage. They're not going to self-victimize and have a premature mortality from homelessness.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We do need these support networks. And Blair, if your parents maybe are not alive anymore or they can't be part of your support network, are there resources available to help provide support? I'm hearing you talk about homelessness a lot, and it makes me think that there aren't really great resources available in addition to just family members that would have to be there. So how does that look in the case of SPD? Is there support available outside the family system?
Yes, if you go online, there are definitely clinics and mental health support. You would absolutely be able to get intervention for yourself, for your child. But think about it also, if the schizoid doesn't know he or she is schizoid, how is the parent? And those homeless people don't know they're schizoid. They just, like me, went into offices, were not able to function, were probably given all the good advice I got, like put out your clothes at night, set your alarm clock 15 minutes earlier. Somebody with a phobia, that's not going to help one iota. So, yes, it's something that is interesting because clinicians will say they don't see them and they don't know they have it. I didn't know. My father would carry on that it was mostly a lack of confidence, and that is one of the symptoms, but certainly not all.
So
They
do
knew
you
something was
believe,
awry.
yeah, and do you believe that this happens a lot because of the conditioning in our childhoods? Or do you think, I'm not too familiar with SPD, but is it considered sort of a genetic disorder? Or is that something that really happens by nurture in childhood?
It's nurture. And Eleanor Greenberg, whose book is the Bible, Borderline Narcissistic and Schizoid, is clear in stating it's poor parenting. It's when they get away from their abusive families and developed whole object, the ability to see good and bad, a more balanced interpretation of other people, then there's a potential to surmount this. But as I said before, no child is born with the defense to be afraid of people. That has to be imprinted, and it was by the time I was 5 years old. My clinician said, "Mother went to work on you." And think about it, years later, I couldn't really work. So I'm asking parents to take responsibility for their approach. I'm asking schizoids to come clean, take the first step, brace yourself, steel yourself to go to a clinician. It will be better than you think. It might even save your life. It will certainly spare you additional trauma at best, which is also important.
Yeah, absolutely. And, hearing you speak about that this could be actually prevented if we knew about it earlier and could support those families that may need that help with parenting, that makes me very sad that there's not more awareness about this, because actually this is the first time I'm hearing about this disorder. So I imagine that many of our listeners may not have heard about it before and are not familiar with it. So I really hope that your book and this episode actually shine a light on this and bring more awareness out into the world so that we can work with this and we can create more support networks that might help prevent this and offer resources so that we can reduce the suffering, I want to say. From the longer this happens, the more debilitating it seems to become. So thank you for sharing your story, and thank you for joining me here today and sharing also about your book. I feel these are massive resources for people to get to know more about SPD.
Thank you for having me. And I do hope exactly what you said is the net result.
Exactly. Yeah. I feel we need to put the word out more and hear more stories like your own story. And again, as you said, there won't be any meetups for people with SPD, but maybe through this, maybe through these remote podcasts that are, not recorded in person, we can offer ways and spaces for these conversations to take place. And so thank you again so much for your time, and thank you for sharing. And we will, of course, be linking to your book in the show notes as well. So listeners, if you want to find out more, or maybe you know someone who may have SPD or might need some support, let's spread the awareness about this into the world, and hopefully we can make a change from the bottom up in this. We definitely need more on this in our mental health world. So thank you, Blair. I appreciate you. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and take care and be well. And we will see you in the next episode.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Jōrni Podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Jōrni on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejōrni.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.